dirt road leading to the watchtower was little more than a scar carved into the wilderness, twisting and turning like it didn't really want you to get where you needed to be. Danny Porter gripped the steering wheel of his beat-up Bronco, wincing every time a loose rock clattered against the undercarriage. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows over the trees, and the road seemed endless, winding higher and higher. "Hell of a place to start a new gig," Danny muttered to himself, rolling his shoulders to shake off the tension and nerves, which were stemming from his first day at a new post. The tower finally came into view, its rusting skeletal frame silhouetted against the blood-orange sky. A faint wisp of smoke curled from the cabin at its top, and Danny could just make out a figure of a man leaning against the railing. "Well, hey there, Tom," Danny said to himself. Tom Mercer was the guy Danny was replacing. 30 years on the job, according to the supervisor who'd briefed Danny the week before. A bit of an old-timer, a little anal and set in his ways, but he's solid. He'll show you the ropes, and then he's off to enjoy a desk job in the city for his remaining working years. Danny parked at the base of the tower and stepped out, the forest air cool and sharp against his face. He tilted his head back, squinting up at the figure above him. "Hey," Danny called out, his voice echoing faintly. Tom, who was looking down at him, waved, a jerky, exaggerated motion, before disappearing from sight. A moment later, the metal ladder rattled under heavy boots as the older man descended. Tom was tall and wiry, with a weathered face that looked like it had seen more sun than shade. His uniform shirt hung loose on his frame, and his hands were big and gnarled. Workers' hands, Danny thought. "Danny Porter, right?" Tom asked, his voice gravelly but warm. He held out a hand, which Danny took. The older man's grip was a little too firm, and he held on a little too long. "That's me," Danny replied. "Nice to meet you." "Well, Danny, welcome to the edge of fucking nowhere." Tom gestured broadly to the surrounding forest, the faint trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "This place is for an acquired taste, but I have a feeling you'll get used to it. Or maybe you won't." Danny chuckled awkwardly, unsure how to respond. "Well, I'm looking forward to it. Always wanted to work out here in the thick of it, you know?" "Yeah, well, you sound like me 30 years ago," Tom said, and his eyes seemed to linger on Danny's face for longer than was needed. The older man smiled and faltered, if just for a second. Tom then turned and led him up the stairs, the metal creaking under their weight. The climb felt longer than it should have, each step echoing in the still, evening air. By the time they reached the cabin, Danny's legs burned a little, but he didn't complain. It was something he knew that he'd soon get accustomed to. The interior of the cabin was cramped but functional. It housed a desk cluttered with maps and a pair of battered chairs that looked old enough to have been sat on by at least 10 decades worth of ass. An open fire crackled softly in the corner, filling the cabin with a faint smoky warmth. "This is your new home," Tom said, spreading his arms. "Not much, but it's enough. You got your firefinder over there, radio here, logbook there. Have you ever worked a tower this remote before, son?" "Not quite this out the way," Danny admitted. "But I'm looking forward to the peace and quiet. I've been a ranger now for 6 years, so I'm sure I'll be okay." Tom nodded, his somewhat intense gaze drifting to the window. The sun was slipping just below the horizon, the sky bleeding into deep purples and blues. "Well, it's most definitely quiet out here. You just keep your eyes open for smoke, keep the radio on, and log everything you see. And if you see or hear anything weird, you call it in." Danny frowned. "Weird?" "Yeah, you know, people wandering around where they shouldn't be, strange lights, voices." "Voices?" Danny laughed. "Damn, is it that quiet around here that another voice is considered weird?" But he noticed that Tom didn't laugh with him. In fact, the older man looked as if he had frozen for just a few seconds, his eyes staring directly into the younger man's before normality seemed to return to him, and he shifted a little. "People hear things out here," Tom said, his tone flat. "Sometimes you'll see things, stuff that doesn't make sense. When you're out in the middle of nowhere for long enough, your mind plays tricks on you. Or maybe it doesn't, and I'm just talking out my ass." Danny wasn't too keen on the way Tom's expression seemed to darken as he spoke, like he was remembering something he'd rather forget. Anyway, Tom said, clapping Danny on the shoulder with enough force to make him stumble, you'll do just fine. Just keep your wits about you. Tom spent the next hour showing the new guy the ins and outs of the job. How to calibrate the fire finder, which frequencies to use on the radio, where to log sightings. But he wasn't quite as thorough as Danny had been led to believe he was going to be. In fact, it all seemed a little rushed. And the whole time there was something about the older man that seemed off. It was as if he was heavily distracted, distant somehow. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the way his hands lingered on the equipment, like he wasn't sure if he wanted to let it go, or even as if he forgot how to. When the swift lesson was over, Tom stood by the door, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. Well, he said, I guess this is it. 30 years. And now it's all yours. You're heading out tonight? Danny asked. You're not staying for the shift? Tom shook his head. Nah, I'm gonna go pay my lovely wife a visit. The truck's there if you need it. Key's over there on that hook. Pay my wife a visit? That's a real strange way to put it, Danny thought, but he didn't mention it. Well, in that case, he said, good luck with the new job. Hope it all works out for you. Tom's smile returned, thin and just a little strange. Thanks, son. You take care now and don't let the boogeyman get you. Hey, I might be glad of his company if it's as quiet as you say, Danny replied with a laugh. Oh, I doubt that, Tom said, and let out a laugh of his own, but Danny thought it was more of a cackle. As Tom disappeared down the ladder, Danny stood alone in the cabin, the forest stretching endlessly below him, and for the first time, the vastness of it all felt somewhat daunting. The quiet settled in like a weight, and Danny couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unsaid between him and the older man. The crackle of the walkie-talkie coming to life caused Danny to jump. The voice that came through was Tom's. Say, Danny, I felt like I was a little too hasty in rushing off. I'll tell you what, come down and I'll give you a quick sweep of the surrounding area. Thanks for the offer, Danny replied, but I'll find my way around. You get yourself home. I'm a big boy. I'll be okay. But thanks. The radio crackled again, but nothing was said, at least not for a few seconds. I insist, came the reply, finally. Danny stared at the walkie-talkie, not really knowing what to say, but the device remained silent. He didn't want to offend the old guy on his last day at the tower. Sure, I'll be right down, Tom, Danny replied. Just give me a minute. Danny clipped the walkie-talkie to his shirt, fiddling with it for a moment to make sure it was secure. He didn't really want to go on a walk with Tom, who in truth, kinda gave him the creeps, but he needed to stay professional, and he wanted the man to know the place was being left in safe hands. He turned toward the ladder, but stopped mid-step. The strangest feeling hit him, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart skip a beat. At first, it felt he was being watched, but then he thought that wasn't quite it. But something was wrong. His eyes drifted across the room, assessing everything in there, before landing on the large freezer box in the corner. He'd noticed it earlier, but hadn't thought much of it. A lot of the old towers had freezers like that, for long-term food storage when supplies were low. But now, the box seemed to stick out like a sore thumb, which to Danny made no sense. He looked at the freezer. Its surface was scuffed and dented. The lid weighed down with a mishmash of items, coiled ropes, a folded tarp, an old first aid kit. Nothing about it seemed particularly unusual, but Danny couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. It was as if the freezer itself was trying to get his attention. He took a step closer, his boots scraping softly against the floorboards. His mouth was dry. Get a fucking grip, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head, feeling frustrated with himself. But still, the feeling persisted. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper, more primal, like a warning bell ringing in the back of his mind. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the items piled on the top of the freezer box. Tom's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie, clipped and distant. You coming, Porter? Don't you keep me waiting now. Danny ignored it. His focus was fixed on the freezer, his fingers moving on their own as they began clearing the clutter off the lid. He piled the items to the side, his breath growing shallow with each movement. When the last object was removed, he stood there for a moment, staring at the scratched, grimy surface of the lid. His hands were trembling as he gripped the handle, though it didn't feel as cold as he had imagined it would. Was the thing even switched on? He didn't want to open it, but he had to. With a deep breath, he yanked the lid open. The smell hit him first, a sickly sweet stench that made his stomach lurch. It was the kind of smell you couldn't mistake for anything else. It was rot, decay, death. He stumbled back a step, one hand clamping over his nose and his mouth, but he knew he had to take a look inside. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness of the freezer, illuminating its contents. A body, or what was left of one. The bare torso was half-eaten, ragged chunks of flesh torn away to expose glistening bone and sinew. The face, or what had once been one, was locked in a grimace, the skin pale and waxy. One eye was missing, as was most of both cheeks. The body looked to have been crammed in there, the arms at odd angles, and Danny saw that all but one of the fingers were missing. However, the thing which made Danny's blood run even colder wasn't the gore, or even the putrid smell. It was the face itself looking up at him. It was Tom's. The hair, the jawline, he was a distinguished-looking man, and even with the chunks of meat missing from the face, it was unmistakable. It was Tom. Danny stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the floor, its beam spinning wildly around the room. His breathing was ragged, his mind racing. "What the actual fuck is going on?" he whispered, his voice shaking. The walkie-talkie crackled to life again. "You, find what you're looking for, Danny?" Danny whipped his head toward the window. Down below, he could just make out the figure of Tom. The other Tom, standing at the edge of the forest, staring up at the tower. The man waved, his movements slow and deliberate, almost mocking. Danny staggered back toward the door, his hand fumbling for the revolver holstered at its side. "Porter," the voice came again, smooth and calm. "Where are you?" Danny turned back to the window, but Tom was gone. Only the dark forest remained, stretching out like a black maw waiting to swallow him whole. He stood frozen at the top of the ladder, his knuckles white as they gripped the railing. His heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. He needed to act cool, play it off. The cold wind brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and decay. Below, the forest loomed, dark and endless, and there he was, Tom Mercer, standing at the base of the tower. The man, or the imposter, looked up, grinning, and it wasn't a friendly grin. It was stretched too wide, his teeth bared like a wolf sizing up its prey. Danny swallowed hard, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. He tried to force his voice to sound steady, casual. "Hey, Tom, just grabbing my walkie. Sorry for the delay." But Tom didn't answer, didn't wave, didn't move. He just stared up at Danny, his grin holding strong. Danny's gut screamed at him to stay in the tower, to bolt the hatch and call for help. But what help was there? The nearest outpost was miles away, and he doubted Tom, or whoever it was, would just wait around for someone else to show up. "I'm coming down," Danny said, trying to keep his voice steady. He moved down the ladder, trying to act like his limbs weren't seizing with fear. The metal rungs were cold and slick under his hands, and his boots made soft thuds as they met each step. As he descended, he risked a glance down. Tom was still there, but he wasn't standing anymore. He was climbing, and fast. Tommy's body moved with an animalistic grace, his hands and feet hitting the rungs in perfect rhythm, his long limbs bending in ways that seemed unnatural. His eyes were wide now, but totally obsidian, and gleaming in the dim light, and his mouth was open, far too open. Danny froze mid-step. "Tom?" he managed to croak, though his voice was barely a whisper. Tom didn't answer, he just kept climbing, faster than any man should be able to. His head tilted slightly to the side like he was savoring the fear radiating off Danny, who headed back for the hatch and clambered inside, slamming the door down and sliding the bolt across. Danny backed away from the hatch, his gun drawn. "I don't know who you are, or what the fuck is going on here, but you better get the hell away from me or I'll blow your goddamn brains out." Now why would you want to do something like that, Danny boy? The voice was a little muffled due to the thick wood of the door which separated them. I found him. I found Tom, Danny said. Well now, how can you have found Tom? When I'm Tom? What a silly Billy thing to say. He's in the freezer. I found him, Danny replied, his voice sounding panicked. A laugh came from the other side of the door. Then it calmed. All you found was my dinner. The laughter then rose once again. Then Danny heard movement. It came from below as if something was shifting on the underside of the floor. Soon it was behind him, then above. Danny lost his cool and fired 2 shots at the ceiling, where he guessed whatever was out there might be. Silence followed, and the only sounds the younger man could hear were his own breathing, and then the dry gulping sound he made as he swallowed hard. And then, on the other side of the window, it appeared, upside down and smiling. But it wasn't Tom, it was a perfect replication of Danny himself. Danny's head began to spin. He staggered to the right, willing himself not to pass out. He fired off 2 more shots, but his aim was wild, and nowhere near his intended target. He then shifted away from the window until his legs hit the edge of the freezer. Danny toppled backwards, landing on the mutilated corpse of Tom, the real Tom. He knew that he was blacking out with shock, and could only watch as the thing, which had now transformed itself into the naked, mutilated version of Tom, the version which Danny was now sat on top of, crept slowly towards him. With just a second or 2 left of consciousness, Danny raised the gun and fired off 2 more rounds, and as everything faded to black, had he imagined hearing a deafening scream, a roar of pain, or had it just been wishful thinking?